give additional attendees to join, and we'll get started. Hello, everyone. This is Dylan Bowder, Solutions Engineer for RapidScale. I just mentioned about a minute ago, we're going to give it probably just one more minute to let additional people join. We're about 2 minutes after the hour right now. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. The attendee count has slowed down just a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get going. Just a quick intro. My name is Dylan Bowders, once again, Senior Solutions Engineer for RapidScale. I'm typically based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I mostly cover the eastern half of the U.S. With some strategic interaction with other opportunities and other partners in other parts of the U.S. Happy to be on today, actually joining you out of DC area, meeting up with a customer today. So really looking forward to this webinar today. It's kind of close to my heart, kind of one of my passions when it comes to the larger solution set that we represent at RapidScale, so specific to security. I think there's, especially when it comes to cloud, there's a lot of desire around security to ensure that environments and data and intellectual property is protected properly. And we're going to focus a little bit on the WannaCry exploit. But I think what we're going to kind of loosely follow the slide deck today. It's going to be more kind of conversational, and we'll take some questions in the GoToMeeting application. Have my trusty helper from our marketing group, Summer, who will be helping out with some of those questions, and then we'll answer those. If she's not able to answer those throughout the course of the webinar, we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. All right, so Summer, if we can go to slide 2. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available and sent out to all attendees that have registered for the webinar afterwards. Again, if we have any questions, go ahead and present those through the chat session. We'll either answer those throughout the course of the webinar via chat, or Summer will chime in at the end, and we'll answer those to the best of our ability at the end of the webinar. Here we go. Business impact of exploits and security-related incidents throughout the world. In a survey, 3/4 of IT leaders reported that their networks had some type of a breach. In the past 2 years, 160 million records of compromised information have been exploited. That's a pretty decent number. You've got backup and advanced recovery can help reduce some of that by about $2 million annually, and there's additional mechanisms that we can put in place to not only prevent but also identify breaches. 69% of consumers are less inclined to do business with you or your customers if you have a breach that has been publicly announced. And for a lot of larger organizations and enterprises, they have to announce if they've had a breach, and that obviously has an impact. Maybe not financially initially, but reputation is a lot of what I like to consult on. It's not what's the impact if your website's down or what's the impact if your environment's down. financially, but what's the reputation impact to your business? And it's really hard to put a dollar figure on that, but it resonates with the C-suite. It resonates with the board of those companies. And then 60% of small businesses just straight up fail within 6 months of a significant cyber attack. So pretty significant. And what we're going to talk about today is some different strategies you can take to mitigate exposure, mitigate risk, and identify when threats have actually exploited vulnerabilities. What are the most common cyber threats? And there's a bunch. These definitely hit the major points. So malware, typically that's going to be delivered either via a web page or via email. A lot of times you don't really know what's happening. You might not know that it's even happened at all. Sometimes it will identify itself by slowing down your laptop or your PC, or it may, your PC or laptop or operating system may start acting weird. The majority of desktops out there today have or I should say users inside of their operating system have the ability to execute code. And that's really ultimately the vulnerability that's being exploited, is the fact that when that malicious code gets to the end user, it has the ability to execute. That's a big problem, and we can talk about ways of reducing that vulnerability. Ransomware, malicious software that blocks access to data or threatens to delete or publish it unless a ransom is paid. A lot of times it'll encrypt the data, so it's no longer recoverable or readable unless Bitcoin is paid or some type of ransom is paid. And that can present itself as a DDoS attack as well. I've seen scenarios where companies will get a DDoS attack. It'll essentially bring down their office network, their web page, their server environment, and it'll be a short attack. It'll be enough to raise attention and get awareness. It'll be followed by some kind of a ransom email. So those can also have a significant impact to the company. And then DDoS, where whether it's ransomware or it's just a flat-out denial of service, it's going to bring the target, whatever that target may be, bring that target completely offline, essentially, because the pipe or connectivity that is serving that environment is completely saturated. That's done by leveraging thousands of exploited end devices, whether it's Internet of Things, routers, PC servers that have not been patched or aren't properly secured, and small streams of data. If you think about how springs go to streams, go to creeks, or lead to rivers that lead to the ocean. The more that you pour into that funnel, the bigger it gets. Ultimately, you're only going to have so much of a pipe going down inside infrastructure. So that's a denial of service, typically in the form of distributed. Phishing. Phishing is a technique to deliver ransomware or malware. That's where it appears to be Bank of America, or appears to be Target, or appears to be some institution. And by fooling the end user into thinking that they're resetting their password, they're actually capturing the password. The user may not even realize that they've done something wrong, but ultimately, at the end of the day, their credit card's stolen, or their identity has been stolen and is being used, or whatever the exploit is, or whatever the malicious party is trying to gain access to, or information they're trying to get access to. And then web application attacks, and don't think a firewall is going to protect you from these things. In fact, a lot of next-gen firewalls don't really have the necessary analytics and intelligence to protect from things like SQL injections, cross-site scripting, backdoor. There's about 5 or 6 categories that PCI specifically identifies as threat types that need to be blocked by a legitimate web application firewall. And this is for any kind of web, a public-facing web application, your website, your intranet. There could be some kind of application, that third-party application you're serving out of your environment. Those are all potentially vulnerable properties on the internet that could be exploited and take your organization down, or take intellectual property. Somewhere, if we go to the next slide. So the WannaCry attack specifically, obviously it got a ton of press. It was a little bit unique in the way that it exploited the type of data that it was going after, the way that it spread. But ultimately, we've had numerous examples of WannaCry type exploits throughout the years of our information superhighway being online. Code Red, way back in the day, that was actually named after the red type of Mountain Dew, I believe, for the coder that ultimately identified it. So the way WannaCry works, it's kind of a two-stage exploit. Leverages ransomware to infect the system. It will encrypt and infect the user's system and hold it ransom. But it also, on the back end, leverages a worm type infection system where it can then spread to additional machines within that environment. And none of that really requires any kind of human intervention. It initially has to have a transport to get in, some type of authorization, even though that authorization is going to be some kind of normal day-to-day activity of the user. And then all of a sudden, your entire environment is under ransom. And you either have a way of identifying it and fixing it internally, or you pay the ransom. There have been, and a lot of times, these zero-day type exploits or vulnerabilities, I should say, have patches. But unless you have a system in place to patch them in a reasonable amount of time to prevent the exploit, then your systems are vulnerable. And in the traditional form of IT, where you have workstations that have independent operating systems, which I know it kind of sounds weird to even say it that way, but when you compare it to a DAS or VDI type environment, you have a whole lot more control over that. You have laptops out in the field, all running independent operating systems that rely on a common management patch system to identify that the system needs to be patched, and then patch the system, and then validate that the patch has been installed. That traditional style of IT leaves not only the environment to be very vulnerable, but it also is significantly harder to maintain compliance and to maintain patching those exploits. And there are certainly ways of reducing that overhead and increasing your response time to those zero-day type exploits and that have been vulnerabilities that have been patched. If we could go to the next slide then. So what do we do in this big scheme of security and exploits? The first thing we want to do is mitigate risk, and not only mitigate risk, but mitigate exposure as well. Sit down with the IT team, sit down with the CIO, CSO, and understand how the company does business, how they deliver technology, what systems are in place today to mitigate the risk. It's typically going to be, we've got a firewall, and we have antivirus and anti-malware on our desktops. That is only so effective. Mitigating exposure could be things like we have an email appliance on site with our own Exchange server. Ultimately, that means that the MX records are exposing their environment. They may have an intranet server or their public-facing website that is also being hosted at their office or in their co-location. Either way, they're exposing their infrastructure by way of DNS. So let's talk about how we can mitigate that exposure, because ultimately, if we can mitigate exposure so that the offending party is attacking a security solution that knows about their types of attack, then we're mitigating the risk of vulnerabilities and exploits within the environment that ultimately the web is being hosted at or the email is being hosted at, because we have these interim steps. Identifying breaches, and this is where most companies will fall flat on their face if they go through an audit, because they really don't have a mechanism of identifying the breach. And if you don't know there's a breach, how can you remediate it? So identifying breaches, the way you do that is by analyzing traffic on a local network, analyzing logs and traffic from firewalls. If you have a web application firewall in place, analyzing the events that come from that. looking at logs on local systems, doing file integrity monitoring on local systems. So what that means is we have a web server. We know it's Red Hat Enterprise Linux running Apache. Because we know that information, we know the structure of the file system, we know a baseline of what the files should be doing, what files should be changing, what directories and systems shouldn't be changing. And if something changes because an attacker has gotten past the external filters, the firewall filters, and have gotten into the system, how do we identify that? Well, with file integrity monitoring, we'll notice that they've created a new directory, and suddenly they start loading in executable scripts inside of that temporary directory. And we'll be able to identify before they become malicious that something has happened. Identify it, remediate it, and now we're back to operating, but we probably did not actually have any downtime as a result of the fact that we had those mechanisms in place. So it's really a multi-level structured approach and strategy when we talk about cybersecurity. Summer, if we could go to the next slide. So mitigating risk, different levels. Perimeter defenses. So you have your web filtering, which can either be at the perimeter or actually out in the cloud, and mitigating that exposure to the perimeter. Firewall policies, it could be a next-gen firewall. You've got patch management. Patch management is not just going to be desktops, it's going to be servers, it's going to be network appliances as well. Just because you have a firewall in place doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to ever be vulnerable itself. Some firewalls base their technology on open source code, in which cases you need to patch that. You need to be up to speed on the latest general public availability code for those network appliances. Mobile device management. So you've got cell phones that are out in the field. You've got laptops that are out in the field. Mobile device management typically historically has been kind of identified as cell phones, and being able to manage and monitor and remediate things like theft and data leak on just cell phones and iPads. But that same policy and same control can be done on laptops that are out in the field as well. Password policy is super important. If you have a compliance that you adhere to, your customers have compliances, they almost certainly have a password policy requirement. If they don't have that compliancy requirement, they almost certainly should have their own internal policy that expires passwords, that has a minimum complexity for passwords, and secure portals that allow them to obviously go in and change those passwords if they feel like there's some kind of risk or on that schedule that the passwords expire. User access control. So this means things like Bob from accounting shouldn't have access to the web server or to the SQL server, as an example. And then you can kind of take that same example and run it across. The programmers shouldn't have access to the QuickBooks database or the file structure that has the spreadsheets for payroll or whatever it may be. So not only having a policy, but having the ability to audit that policy and validate that the proper users have proper access and not more than what they need. And then really probably one of the most important that a lot of companies don't really invest in, I guess they assume common sense should be relied on, but user education and awareness. And there's a lot of companies out there that specialize in programs and online learning for user education and awareness. Again, a lot of the companies that you might work with may already have that as a requirement for their compliancy. Any company that can lose and have their reputation tarnished or have a financial impact due to users not being aware of best practice should probably subscribe to some of that online learning and have a regular refresher on that online learning. New employees coming in every 6 months or every year, having the users go back through, because security exploits and the mechanisms of exploiting systems and users and phishing changes, it evolves, because as users learn about it, the malicious parties obviously realize that this is no longer as effective as it used to be. Let's come up with a new way of doing it. Users don't know about that, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be effective. So now we've got to train the users on that. So that's super important. To the extent of, they have companies, there's businesses out there that will specialize in professional services for evaluating a company's position on social engineering and exploits. They'll go through a whole slew of different techniques to try and exploit a company. Obviously, it's not malicious. It's a test. It's to validate a company's position and how effective they've been in educating their employees. But we'll take a thumb drive, put some malicious code on it, drop it in front of an office building or in the hallway or whatever it may be, and wait a couple hours. I mean, literally takes about that long. And then what happens with that thumb drive, we'll phone home and say, this thumb drive has been plugged in, and whoever it was that plugged it in failed, obviously, in being smart about what they're doing. They'll go through and attempt to make phone calls to employees and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and would you mind giving me this information, or can you get me access to this thing? There's tons of different ways of validating whether or not users are properly considering security in their day-to-day lives, even though their responsibility and job position isn't around security. Everybody in the company really is a vulnerability to be exploited. So it's a multi-level approach. And at the end of the day, you really need to deploy different systems and different strategies for mitigating that risk. That's what this whole slide's about. So data protection, that could be backups. It could be disaster recovery. Typically, that's not one and the same. A really good backup solution is not really going to have a fantastic disaster recovery component, and vice versa. And those worlds are merging, but a good strategy today is still to kind of keep those separate. So what solutions do we have for mitigating some of that risk? Cloud recovery, which is our disaster recovery solution. It gives you the ability to not only protect a production environment to a secondary site, but there's some value add beyond just an insurance policy. So it gives you the ability to leverage what's called a journal, so that as changes are being made in the production environment, as they're being replicated to the disaster recovery side to be committed to a standby virtual machine, that same journal can be used to roll back the production virtual machine, potentially prevent from having to go to a disaster recovery scenario and failing over, but being able to roll back that production side VM or files inside of that VM to a previous state at nearly any point in time within some amount of short history, 24 hours, 48 hours, etc. So if we talk about what some of these exploits are and what they do to systems, you're going to know typically within 48 hours if it's malicious. Big time attacks are much more strategic, and they will wait sometimes months before they come out and actually start doing things after they've actually exploited the system. But in most cases, being able to roll back within 48 hours to nearly any point in time to a specific system is really, really valuable. Cloud backup is going to give you the ability to restore an entire system. It's going to give you off-site data survivability. It's a disaster solution. It's not a disaster recovery solution in most cases. So it does aid in business continuity, but a typical backup solution is not going to give you the ability to recover as well. And certainly there are solutions that will back up, that will replay into some kind of virtual machine, but there's challenges in giving you long-term retention and still giving you the ability to restore a virtual machine into an environment at that DR side within a short period of time. There's still some challenges there, but certainly there are solutions that can do that to an extent. Cloud mail, which is, again, these are kind of our marketing buckets, but with Mimecast. Mimecast is a multifaceted mail suite, mail security, mail archiving, e-discovery, legal hold, large file send. There's lots of components to Mimecast. Specifically today, the reason we mentioned Mimecast is because it does have some very intelligent security components around things like phishing, targeted threat protection, impersonation protect, sandboxing, URL rewrites. So if it's a malicious URL, it'll go out and check the URL. The URL that's actually delivered in the email to the end user is not the malicious URL, so that Mimecast can then screen it before it actually is delivered to the end user, or before that content is delivered to the end user. So a lot of really, really important components to the Mimecast solution given that a lot of exploits are delivered via email. It's a really important one. Cloud security is a suite of security products. We leverage a couple of different vendors to round out our security products. We provide first-level support for all of those. So even though we are using best-of-breed third parties on the back end, we still provide that first-level customer support for all of those, including Mimecast, so that we're doing our best to provide a consistent customer experience from a support perspective. I think that's really, really important, even though on the back end, again, we're still leveraging best-of-breed technologies that are recognized by the industry, recognized by parties like Gartner and Forrester, and in some cases there's some people will think there's bias when it comes to Gartner and Forrester because you'd have to pay to be a part of those, but they do go through some very rigorous evaluations to actually be positioned in those different either quadrants or waves depending on the evaluation. So there's definitely some value to those evaluations, but ultimately the industry and the sales inside of those products really speaks volumes to their effectiveness. And then I mentioned earlier, bringing your roaming data, your workstations, laptops, bringing all that data into an isolated environment with desktop as a service or VDI allows you to really lock down and prevent data leak or much better manage data leak, much better manage patch deployment, and eliminate the ability for code to execute inside of that desktop environment. So it's really leaps and bounds more secure, and then we can talk about mobility and other reasons why DAS and VDI are good value propositions for lots of companies, but specific to security, again, you're bringing all of that data that today in traditional IT is at the airport, it's at the branch office, it's at the home of the remote worker, and if that laptop is stolen or exploited, or there's not a password policy, there's not a screen lockout after 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and somebody else gains access to it. All of that can be much better controlled and isolated with a desktop as a service or VDI environment. I could probably talk about this slide for another hour probably, but Summer, if we go to the next slide. Now, I've talked about a decent amount of what's on this slide here, but we have a little bit of a diagram, and I'll just touch again on some of what we can provide your end customers when it comes to solutions to mitigate risk. Cloud recovery, again, that's going to be leveraging the Zerto underlying replication. A lot of companies use Zerto. It's the industry unicorn, maybe. It's when it comes to disaster recovery. They do a really, really great job of capturing changed blocks within either VMware or Hyper-V, replicating that across the wire into a target environment. The way it's implemented is going to be different from service provider to service provider. What we do for disaster recovery is we charge for storage. We charge for the Zerto license. We don't charge for standby compute resources. And what that gains you is consistent replication. There's plugins to provide application consistency within certain applications inside of the virtual machine. It gives you a near real-time RPO. There's, of course, a business SLA that's not quite that tight, but in reality, technically, near real-time replication to the DR side. It gives you that journal function for rollback, and the automation that's included with Zerto, whether it's a single VM for recovery on the DR side for testing, the entire environment for testing, or single VMs or the entire environment for live failover. Your RTO, which is recovery time objective, the amount of time it takes to recover the environment, is much, much reduced. Literally, I can do a demo and show a test of a virtual machine being powered on the DR side and online, and you can log into it within 5 minutes. So that's really aggressive from an RTO perspective. Now, when you scale that out to multiple virtual machines and you have applications that need to be brought online, maybe users that need to gain access into that environment, however that may be, even another use case for virtual desktop and DAS in that secondary environment because you can gain access a whole lot faster. We're talking about probably an hour, maybe a couple of hours, depending on the quantity of VMs and that access, but gives you you can sleep good at night knowing that you have the infrastructure in place, the replication in place, and a company like RapidScale there for you, helping in that type of disaster. And then cloud backup, files, directories, replication on a schedule, whether it's a couple or several times a day or once a day, to a remote site with retention. And really that's where backup differs from disaster recovery, is the fact that you're likely going to have long-term retention that's needed, and that's where we can use our cloud backup product to give you that 6 months, a year, 7 years worth of, or more, worth of retention that you can restore from if needed. Usually that's a checkbox. All right, Summer, slide 9. We've spoken about Mimecast, we've talked about mail, a lot of moving mail to the cloud, which in a lot of cases people just assume it's going to be Office 365, and it can be. We can definitely assist with that. We have our own multi-tenant or dedicated Exchange platform we can move users to. What you're doing there is you're mitigating exposure, you're increasing reliability of the infrastructure, and when you put something like Mimecast on top of that, not only do you get a fantastic business continuity solution, which is not what this webinar is about specifically, but you have security add-ons that can nearly guarantee you're not going to have an exploit come in via email. The 100% guarantee that Mimecast does give you is with continuity and availability, because it has the ability to fail over from the primary Exchange environment to the Mimecast cloud. When it comes to security exploits, they're going to give you, I think it's 99.99% of spam and malware that gets filtered out within their solution. And then they have other mechanisms that increase their effectiveness when it comes to, again, URL rewrites, phishing protection. And they also have reverse filtering. So if you notice in this diagram, you have a northbound arrow from the hosting environment, which means if there is an exploited system, it can't spam the internet and then get your IP address blacklisted. That's obviously going to be a problem as well, because if you have users trying to email you, but your Exchange system is blacklisted, then your business is going to be impacted. So they protect in both directions. And then you also have the iPad, iPhone, Windows Phone, BlackBerry, Android devices that you can have the Mimecast application on, and you can see your cloud copy of email. You can read emails, you can send emails. So it's an excellent overlay to an MTA like Exchange. All right, Summer, on the next slide. So the next step is how do we identify breaches? And I've touched on this, I've talked about it a little bit earlier, but what we're going to do here is we're going to analyze logs from things like web application firewalls. And I said firewalls twice because there's web application firewalls, and then there's also premises-based firewalls. Then you also have things like routers that may be providing connectivity to an internal or private connection, maybe to a third party or to another office or branch office. I believe the target exploit actually happened from a third-party processor that was exploited, but ultimately got into target's infrastructure from that back channel. So we want to analyze all of those different areas. We don't want to just assume because our firewall in our environment is public facing that it couldn't come in through another back channel. We need to analyze all of that and know what's happening. But we have solutions that can analyze that traffic, determine if there's malicious or suspicious activity that's happening inside of that traffic. We can do file integrity monitoring so that we can see if those files are changing or directories are being created or executables are being executed within those systems to know if there's actually been a breach. Trying to prevent the breach is one thing. Identifying it is a whole other component. And the analytics that go into the identification of those breaches is something that is constantly evolving. Information from existing breaches that haven't shown up on radar before are feverishly analyzed, and then that analytics is then sent back out into the community for adoption, whether or not it's on that vendor's platform or to open source projects or whatever it may be. But ultimately, getting that artificial intelligence pushed down so that the subscription model works and that you have systems that can be effective with identifying those breaches and either preventing them because they have IPS or reporting them because the actual exploit has already happened. We leverage AlienVault for that. A lot of what I've mentioned around internal security is provided by that AlienVault product. It has the ability to do internal intrusion detection, host-based intrusion detection prevention, file integrity monitoring, internal scanning, and where that's really important is mitigating risk. So we're going to have a scanner that goes and looks at every single server on the network, every single device and asset on the network. It's going to scan the ports. It's going to identify if it's Windows, Linux, a router. It's going to then take that profile and look for vulnerabilities, whether it's OpenSSH on, that could be on a Windows server too, but OpenSSH on a Linux server. Look at the version, compare that to a database and say, well, this version is vulnerable to these exploits. We recommend you patch. So we can do that full scan on the internal network. That's a requirement for PCI, certain levels of PCI, but that certainly shouldn't suggest that non-PCI or non-HIPAA customers shouldn't take those measures. Again, we're looking at the risk to the business and the impact to the overall business if we were to have those types of exploits. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide, Summer. So we have a diagram here, not really a diagram, but the different components of the AlienVault solution. And we have some additional components aside from AlienVault that we can provide additional services to, but ultimately AlienVault is kind of the brain behind a lot of these different components. So the Security Information and Events Manager, which is SIEM, there's a whole Gartner Magic Quadrant just on SIEM. SIEM is just a component of AlienVault because we have much more to a comprehensive security solution than just the SIEM. Asset discovery, so we're going to constantly look to see if there's any new devices on the network, immediately alert when those are there. That's going to raise a flag, and then whoever's responsible for that portal or that dashboard, and by default, RapidScale would be that party, but it's certainly not a requirement. And we can share visibility into that information. So a new workstation was plugged in, a new virtual machine was spun up, a new router was added to the network. Let's classify it. Let's make sure that it's in place and make sure that we identify that as a potential vulnerability on the network, so we can treat it as such. So then to vulnerability assessments, constantly scanning, constantly giving reports based on compliances, and there's I think literally hundreds of reports that can be leveraged and used for HIPAA, PCI, whatever the report needs to be or whatever the audit is. Intrusion detection, host-based, network-based, file integrity. I've talked about those a couple of times. And behavioral monitoring, so we can actually take S-flow and net flow information from routers and firewalls and look at that real-time traffic and identify suspicious activity based on that traffic. Super important. Looking at I think probably some of the biggest, most effective parts of the solution are going to be the host-based file integrity monitoring and the net flow S-flow information, because that's looking at real-time stuff that's going on, whether it's packets on the network or changes to the file system. And when we see something suspicious, we know about it immediately, not 3 months afterwards because all the credit cards are taken or whatever it may be. All right, let's go on to the next slide. The remediation. What happens? Something has happened at this point. We know, however it is, we found out about it, whether it was because we didn't have something in place and now we have some kind of ransom notification, or our upstream network is saturated because we're participating in a distributed denial of service. Whatever the means may be, we need to remediate this now. And really, when it comes to remediation, it's hard to say this is how we're going to remediate something, because we have to speak in terms of what ifs. So what if the vulnerability was a BitLocker on a file system, or what if it's a DDoS, or what if, and then we can come up with what's that resolution or what's that remediation. So for instance, if RapidScale is managing the server and we feel like that server has been exploited And hopefully we have something like AlienVault in place. Hopefully we have something like Encapsula or Fortinet at the border with IPS and IDS in place. We'll respond accordingly. If we have cloud recovery in place, we can leverage that component with the journal to roll back the production system, or if it's impactful enough, we can fail over to the DR environment. And then we have, of course, backup, where we can do a full restore. Depending on the components in place and the services that are subscribed to, we'll, of course, take action accordingly. Now, when it comes to a solution like AlienVault, we can deploy that into a customer's environment that we have no management access to, and we can simply kind of be first-level support, triage, and then escalate according to an escalation path if that's the desired path. Another quick note I wanted to make down here, and I've talked about it a couple times already, but that multi-tier solution is really what is going to be effective. Trying to put all your basket is likely not going to be effective. You really want to have the full visibility into external services coming into the network, the perimeter, and also what if happens, how do we know that, how do we prevent it on the inside of the network. Fortunately, most organizations allocate budget for something like that, either a requirement based on compliancy or a breach has already happened. There's been impact, and now they are kind of forced to. And remediations are not expensive at all. We can get to the next slide. So, if someone can maybe chime in, talk about what our next webinar will be, and if we have questions, of course, then address.
Yeah, so just really quick note, we moved our next sales webinar to the second Wednesday of July instead of the first Wednesday, just because that first one was the day right after the 4th of July. So we figured it would be better timing. This will be the first one where you'll hear from our new EVP of Sales and Marketing, Bob Buchanan. So really excited for that. I believe we're going to go really in depth on some deals and exactly how those deals were made. It'll be called The Anatomy of a Deal. So excited for you guys to join that one. Just wanted to make sure you knew that the date had been changed. Dylan, just so you know, your phone was breaking up a little, so let's see if we can still hear you when we ask this question that came in. If the server is infected with malware and you make a backup to it, can this also contaminate the information in the cloud backup?
Great question, and hopefully you can hear me all right. I think I'm going to answer that with two different answers because that scenario, I think, could potentially impact DR solution. So let's talk about that a couple of ways. For the backup solution, you're going to have point-in-time kind of snaps in terms of when backups are completed. So if the system is infected and their backup runs, backup will be contaminated. But the previous backup or the backup that you did prior to the infection would have the files and unencrypted data, whatever the infection was. Same type of consideration with the disaster recovery solution, like Zero. Once the infection happens, those blocks are going to be replicated, but because of that malfunction, you can roll back to point in time prior to infection. The challenge there would be when was infection. So we can, at that point in time, we can then go into the and roll back that impacted systems.
Hey, Bill.
So were you able to hear all that okay?
Yeah, we can't actually hear you that well. So everyone, we will send out the answer to that question following the call. Make sure you just, if you have any other questions on this topic, please send them over my way, and you will also have Dylan on the email. He can be asking these directly. Luckily, that audio issue started happening when we were done with the webinar, so that's okay. So you will be hearing from me. You'll get a recording of today's webinar as well as a copy of the deck. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them over. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and we'll end it there. You can have 15 minutes back. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Summer.